Harold Jenkins adjusted his old baseball cap and stepped out of his small apartment building on Maple Street. The morning sun felt warm on his weathered face as he began his daily walk to the corner store. At 90 years old, Harold moved slowly but steadily, his wooden cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk. The neighborhood had changed so much over the years. Harold remembered when these streets were filled with families who knew each other's names, where children played safely in their yards, and where respect for elders was something parents taught their kids from birth. Now, many of the houses stood empty, and the young people seemed angry about everything. Harold had lived in this same neighborhood for 67 years. He bought his little house right after returning from the Korean War, when he was just 23 years old and full of dreams. Back then, the area was bustling with life. Neighbors helped neighbors, and everyone looked out for the elderly folks on their street. His wife Martha had loved their morning walks together. They would stroll hand in hand to Murphy's Market, talking about their plans for the day or sharing memories from their younger years. Martha had been gone for 8 years now, but Harold continued their tradition. It made him feel close to her somehow, like she was still walking beside him. The old veteran wore his favorite brown sweater, the one Martha had knitted for him during their 40th wedding anniversary. Despite the warm weather, he always felt cold these days. His legs weren't what they used to be, and his doctor had warned him about walking alone, but Harold was stubborn. Independence was important to him. He had fought for his country's freedom, and he wasn't about to give up his own freedom to walk down the street. As he made his way down the sidewalk, Harold noticed a group of teenagers gathered near the bus stop. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark clothes and looking like they owned the world. They were loud, using language that would have gotten Harold a bar of soap in his mouth when he was their age. They kicked at trash cans and seemed to be looking for trouble. Harold had seen these same kids before. They hung around the neighborhood, causing problems, painting walls, and bothering people who were just trying to go about their business. The police had been called several times, but nothing ever seemed to change. The teenagers always came back, always acting like they had nothing better to do than make other people's lives difficult. One of the boys, a tall kid with spiky black hair, noticed Harold approaching. He nudged his friends and pointed at the old man. Harold could see them whispering to each other and laughing. His stomach tightened with worry, but he kept walking. He had every right to use this sidewalk. He had been walking this route longer than these kids had been alive. The group of teenagers slowly spread out across the sidewalk as Harold got closer. They weren't moving out of the way like polite young people should. Instead, they seemed to be positioning themselves to block his path. Harold's grip tightened on his walking cane. His heart began beating faster, not from the exercise, but from the growing feeling that something bad was about to happen. Harold thought about crossing to the other side of the street, but his pride wouldn't let him. He was a veteran who had served his country with honor. He had faced enemy soldiers and lived through battles that these kids couldn't even imagine. He wasn't going to let a bunch of disrespectful teenagers scare him away from his own neighborhood sidewalk. As he got within a few feet of the group, the tall boy with spiky hair stepped directly into Harold's path. The other teenagers formed a loose circle around them, blocking any easy way for Harold to walk around. Their faces showed no respect, no kindness, just the cruel amusement of young people who thought it was funny to mess with someone who couldn't fight back. Harold stopped walking and looked up at the teenager blocking his way. The boy was at least 6 feet tall and probably weighed twice as much as the elderly veteran. Harold's hands shook slightly, both from age and from the adrenaline that was starting to pump through his system. The morning air suddenly felt heavy with tension. Other people on the street seemed to sense trouble and either crossed to the other side or hurried past without looking. Harold realized he was completely alone with these 5 teenagers, and none of them looked like they were planning to show him the respect that his age and service deserved. Harold cleared his throat and spoke in the firm voice he had learned during his military training. He asked the boys politely to let him pass, explaining that he was just trying to get to the store like he did every morning. But instead of moving aside, the teenagers laughed at him. They mocked his slow way of speaking and made fun of his old clothes and walking cane. The situation was escalating quickly, and Harold could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. He had survived war, but somehow this felt just as frightening. These weren't enemy soldiers following orders in a distant country. These were kids from his own neighborhood who seemed to have no understanding of right and wrong, no respect for their elders, and no fear of consequences for their actions. Harold tried once more to reason with them, his voice now shaking with both fear and anger. He told them about his service to the country, about how he had fought to protect the freedoms they enjoyed every day. But his words only seemed to make them more amused. One of the girls in the group laughed and said something cruel about old people who couldn't take care of themselves. The morning that had started so peacefully was turning into Harold's worst nightmare. He was trapped on his own neighborhood sidewalk by a group of young people who seemed to think his age and vulnerability made him a target for their entertainment. Harold had never felt so alone and helpless in his entire life, not even during the darkest days of his military service overseas. The tall teenager with spiky black hair stepped even closer to Harold, invading his personal space in a way that felt threatening and disrespectful. Harold could smell cigarette smoke on the boy's clothes and see the cruel gleam in his eyes. This wasn't just teenage mischief anymore. This was bullying, pure and simple, and Harold was the target. Harold tried to step around the group, but they moved with him, continuing to block his path. The girl who had made the cruel comment about old people was recording everything on her phone, giggling as she captured Harold's growing distress for what was probably going to be posted on social media later. The thought of being humiliated online made Harold feel sick to his stomach. One of the other boys, shorter but stockier than the leader, began making fun of Harold's military service. He pretended to march like a soldier, mocking the way Harold walked with his cane. The group erupted in laughter at this performance, treating Harold's service to his country like it was some kind of joke. Harold felt his face grow hot with shame and anger. Harold had faced many difficult situations in his 90 years, but this felt different. During the war, at least he had known who the enemy was and why they were fighting. These teenagers weren't fighting for anything. They were just being cruel because they could, because they thought an old man couldn't stop them or fight back. The leader of the group, the tall boy with spiky hair, began to push Harold gently at first, just enough to make him stumble slightly. Each push was accompanied by laughter from the group and more recordings on their phones. Harold tried to maintain his balance, gripping his walking cane tighter and attempting to stay upright despite the growing aggression from the teenagers. Harold's voice cracked as he pleaded with them to leave him alone. He explained that he just wanted to buy his morning newspaper and some milk from the corner store, the same routine he had followed for years. But his vulnerability seemed to encourage them rather than create any sympathy. The teenagers fed off his fear like sharks, sensing blood in the water. The pushing became harder and more frequent. Harold stumbled backward with each shove, his old legs struggling to keep him upright. His walking cane, which had been his steady companion for the past 5 years, felt inadequate to help him maintain his balance against the deliberate attacks from these much younger and stronger tormentors. Other people walking by pretended not to see what was happening. Some crossed the street to avoid getting involved. Others pulled out their phones, but instead of calling for help, they seemed to be recording the incident, just like the teenagers were. Harold couldn't understand how his neighbors could watch an elderly veteran being bullied and not step in to help. The stocky boy who had been mocking Harold's military service decided to grab the old man's walking cane. Harold tried to hold on to it, but his grip wasn't strong enough to resist. Without his cane, Harold's balance became even more precarious. He swayed dangerously as the teenagers continued their harassment, now passing his cane between them like it was some kind of trophy. Harold's eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear. He thought about Martha and how she would have hated to see him treated this way. She had always been so proud of his military service and the way he carried himself with dignity throughout their long marriage. Now, he felt like that dignity was being stripped away by a group of kids who didn't understand or care about what he had sacrificed for their freedom. The girl with the phone moved closer to capture Harold's tears on video. She made cruel comments about how pathetic old people looked when they cried, treating his emotional distress like entertainment. Harold had never felt so humiliated in his entire life. Even during the most difficult moments of his military service, he had maintained his sense of pride and purpose. The tall leader seemed to be getting bored with just pushing Harold around. He looked at his friends, and Harold could see them communicating without words, like a pack of animals planning their next move. Harold's military training kicked in enough for him to recognize that the situation was about to get much worse. These teenagers were working themselves up to something more serious than just harassment. Harold made one last attempt to appeal to their humanity. He told them about his late wife, Martha, about his military service in Korea, about how he had always tried to be a good neighbor and citizen. He asked them to imagine how they would feel if their own grandfathers were being treated this way. But his words fell on deaf ears. If anything, his vulnerability seemed to make them more aggressive. The moment that changed everything happened so quickly that Harold barely understood what was occurring until it was over. The tall boy with spiky hair placed both hands on Harold's chest and gave him a powerful shove. Harold's frail body couldn't absorb the impact or maintain balance without his walking cane. He stumbled backward off the sidewalk and into the street. Time seemed to slow down as Harold fell. He could hear the screech of car brakes and the sound of his own body hitting the asphalt. Pain shot through his hip and shoulder as he landed hard on the unforgiving street surface. The teenagers scattered immediately, running in different directions like cockroaches when a light gets turned on. Harold lay in the street, stunned and hurt, watching the group that had tormented him disappear around corners and into alleyways. The girl who had been recording everything was the last to leave, but she too ran away when she realized that Harold was seriously injured and that witnesses might remember seeing her face. Cars stopped in the street around Harold's motionless form. Drivers got out to check on him, their faces filled with concern and anger about what they had just witnessed. Someone called for an ambulance, while others tried to make Harold comfortable until medical help could arrive. But the teenagers who had caused the situation were long gone, leaving behind only an injured elderly veteran and a group of strangers trying to help. Harold lay on the cold asphalt, feeling more alone than he had since Martha's death. His hip throbbed with pain, and he could taste blood in his mouth from where he had bitten his tongue during the fall. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional hurt of being treated so cruelly by young people from his own neighborhood. As Harold lay injured in the street, several people rushed to his aid. Sarah Martinez, a nurse who had been driving to work, immediately stopped her car and knelt beside him. She checked his pulse and looked for signs of serious injury while speaking to him in a calm, reassuring voice. Sarah had seen the entire incident from her car and was furious about what those teenagers had done to the elderly man. Among the crowd that gathered was David Shun, a local shop owner who had been opening his store when he heard the commotion. David had served in the military himself, though much later than Harold, and he recognized the old baseball cap that marked Harold as a fellow veteran. The sight of an elderly veteran being hurt by disrespectful teenagers made David's blood boil with anger. Mrs. Eleanor Watson, an elderly woman who lived 2 blocks away, had witnessed the entire incident from her front porch. She had been watering her flowers when she saw the group of teenagers surrounding Harold. Eleanor had wanted to help, but at 78 years old and with her own mobility issues, she hadn't been able to move fast enough to intervene. She called the police immediately and gave them detailed descriptions of each teenager. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers. The paramedics carefully examined Harold, checking for broken bones and head injuries. His hip was badly bruised and possibly fractured, and he had multiple scrapes and cuts from hitting the asphalt. They decided to transport him to the hospital for X-rays and further evaluation. As the paramedics worked on Harold, the police officers began interviewing witnesses. Sarah Martinez gave a detailed account of what she had seen, describing how the teenagers had deliberately surrounded Harold, stolen his walking cane, and then pushed him into the street. She was particularly upset about how they had recorded the incident on their phones, treating the old man's suffering like entertainment. David Chun provided additional details about the teenagers, including approximate ages and clothing descriptions. He had recognized a couple of them as kids who had caused trouble at his store before, stealing candy and being disrespectful to customers. David regretted not having called the police about them sooner, wondering if this incident could have been prevented. Mrs. Eleanor Watson hobbled over with her own walking cane to speak with the police. Despite her age, her memory was sharp, and she provided the most detailed descriptions of the teenagers. She had watched from her porch as they deliberately blocked Harold's path and began their harassment. Eleanor was particularly angry about how other people had walked by without helping. Officer Rodriguez, a young policeman with only 3 years on the force, was shocked by what he was hearing. He had grown up in this neighborhood and remembered when it was safe for elderly people to walk around without fear. The idea that local teenagers would attack a 90-year-old veteran made him both sad and angry about what his community was becoming. The second officer, Sergeant Thompson, was a 20-year veteran of the police force who had seen many disturbing incidents, but this one particularly bothered him. His own grandfather had been a World War II veteran, and Sergeant Thompson knew how much elderly veterans valued their independence and dignity. The thought of them being terrorized in their own neighborhoods was unacceptable. As Harold was being loaded into the ambulance, more witnesses came forward. A delivery driver had seen part of the incident from across the street and had recorded some of it on his dashboard camera. A woman walking her dog had heard Harold pleading with the teenagers to leave him alone and had seen them laughing at his distress. The police officers made note of all the witness statements and began the process of identifying the teenagers responsible. They visited the nearby school to show the principal and teachers the witness descriptions, hoping someone could identify the kids involved. The principal was horrified to hear about the incident and promised full cooperation with the investigation. Word of the attack spread quickly through the neighborhood. Many residents were shocked and angry that such a thing could happen on their streets. Several people who knew Harold personally came to the hospital to check on him and offer their support. They brought flowers, cards, and assurances that the community would not tolerate this kind of behavior. Local news crews arrived at the scene after hearing about the incident on police scanners. The story of a 90-year-old veteran being pushed into the street by teenagers was exactly the kind of outrageous incident that would capture public attention. Reporters interviewed witnesses and neighbors, gathering footage and quotes for their evening news broadcasts. The hospital staff treated Harold with extra care when they learned he was a Korean War veteran who had been attacked by teenagers. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Patricia Williams, was particularly gentle during her examination. She discovered that Harold had suffered a hairline fracture in his hip, along with numerous bruises and scrapes. He would need several weeks of recovery time. Harold's niece, Rebecca Jenkins, was contacted by the hospital and rushed to his bedside. Rebecca lived in another state, but was Harold's closest living relative. She was devastated to learn about the attack and immediately began making arrangements to stay in town to help care for her uncle during his recovery. Rebecca couldn't understand how anyone could hurt such a sweet, harmless old man. As news of the incident spread on social media and local news channels, the community reaction was swift and angry. People were outraged that elderly veterans were not safe in their own neighborhoods. Many called for increased police patrols and stricter penalties for teenagers who committed crimes against senior citizens. The story touched a nerve with people far beyond Harold's immediate neighborhood. Veterans organizations across the city condemned the attack and offered their support. Local churches organized prayer services for Harold's recovery. Community groups began discussing ways to better protect elderly residents and ensure that such an incident would never happen again. But even as support poured in from the community, Harold lay in his hospital bed feeling defeated and scared. The physical injuries would heal, but the emotional trauma of being targeted because of his age and vulnerability was much harder to overcome. He wondered if he would ever feel safe walking in his own neighborhood again. The teenagers who had attacked Harold remained at large, having scattered immediately after pushing him into the street. Police were confident they would be identified and arrested soon, given the number of witnesses and the detailed descriptions they had provided. But for now, the perpetrators were free while their victim lay injured in a hospital bed, wondering what had happened to the world he had fought to protect. 2 days after Harold's attack, the story had spread across social media and local news networks throughout the region. The image of a 90-year-old Korean War veteran being pushed into the street by teenagers sparked outrage far beyond Harold's small neighborhood. Among those who heard the story were members of the Marine Corps unit stationed at Camp Pendleton, about an hour's drive from Harold's town. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington was scrolling through his phone during his lunch break when he came across a news article about Harold's attack. As a Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, Marcus felt a deep connection to all veterans, regardless of which branch of service they had joined. Reading about Harold's humiliation and injury made Marcus's jaw clench with anger and determination. Marcus shared the article with his fellow Marines, and the response was immediate and unanimous. Corporal James Mitchell, a young Marine from Texas, spoke for the group when he said that no veteran should ever have to face such disrespect and violence. These Marines understood the sacrifices that previous generations of veterans had made, and they felt a sacred duty to protect and honor those who had served before them. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the highest-ranking Marine in their unit, organized an emergency meeting. The Marines discussed how they could respond to this incident in a way that would support Harold while also sending a clear message to the community about how veterans should be treated. They decided that a show of force and solidarity was exactly what the situation required. The Marines contacted Harold's niece Rebecca at the hospital to ask permission to visit Harold and offer their support. Rebecca was touched by their concern and immediately agreed. She explained that Harold had been deeply depressed since the attack, questioning whether his military service had meant anything if this was how veterans were treated in modern society. Captain Robert Shun, the unit's commanding officer, approved a special mission for his Marines. Their objective was simple: support a fellow veteran who had been attacked and demonstrate to the community that attacks on veterans would not be tolerated. Captain Chin saw this as both a moral obligation and an opportunity to strengthen the bond between active military personnel and veterans. On the morning of their planned visit, 12 Marines gathered at Camp Pendleton in their dress blue uniforms. These weren't casual clothes or everyday military gear. These are the formal uniforms worn for ceremonies and special occasions, representing the absolute best that the Marine Corps had to offer. Every button was polished, every crease was perfect, and every Marine looked like they had stepped out of a recruiting poster. The Marines traveled in a convoy of 3 vehicles, arriving at the hospital precisely at 0900 hours. They moved with military precision as they entered the building, drawing stares from hospital staff and visitors who weren't accustomed to seeing so many Marines in formal uniform. The Marines requested permission to visit Harold Jenkins, explaining to the hospital administrators who they were and why they had come. Rebecca met the Marines in the hospital lobby and was immediately moved to tears by their gesture. She explained that Harold had been struggling with depression and feelings of worthlessness since the attack. The sight of these active duty Marines coming to honor him might be exactly what he needed to begin healing emotionally as well as physically. Harold was dozing in his hospital bed when Rebecca gently woke him to tell him about his visitors. At first, Harold was confused and thought she might be talking about more police officers or reporters. But when she explained that 12 Marines had come specifically to see him, Harold's eyes filled with tears of disbelief and gratitude. Staff Sergeant Washington entered Harold's room first, followed by the other Marines in formation. The sight of these young, strong Marines in their perfect uniforms standing at attention in his small hospital room overwhelmed Harold completely. He hadn't seen active-duty military personnel since his own discharge over 60 years ago. Staff Sergeant Washington stepped forward and saluted Harold with crisp military precision. The other Marines followed suit, creating a moment of pure respect and honor that Harold had never experienced in his civilian life. The old veteran tried to return the salute from his hospital bed, his hands shaking with emotion as much as with age. Corporal Mitchell presented Harold with a certificate of appreciation that the Marines had prepared, thanking him for his service to the country and acknowledging the sacrifices he had made during the Korean War. The certificate was signed by every Marine in their unit, making it a truly personal tribute from one generation of warriors to another. Sergeant Rodriguez explained to Harold that Marines never forget their fellow veterans and that the attack he had suffered was an attack on all who had served. She assured him that his service had mattered, that his sacrifices had protected the freedoms that even those disrespectful teenagers enjoyed every day, and that he deserved to be treated with honor and respect. Harold struggled to find words to express his gratitude. He told the Marines about his service in Korea, about losing friends in battle, about coming home to a country that didn't always appreciate what veterans had done. He confessed that after the attack by the teenagers, he had begun to wonder if his service had been meaningless. The Marines listened respectfully as Harold shared his story, asking thoughtful questions about his experiences and showing genuine interest in learning from a veteran who had served before any of them were born. They created a connection across generations that transcended the specific wars they had fought and the decades that separated their service. Captain Chun arrived at the hospital with additional Marines and a surprise that would shock Harold even more. The captain had arranged for local news crews to cover the Marines' visit, ensuring that the story of respect and honor would receive as much attention as the original attack had gotten. He wanted the community to see how real Americans treated their veterans. As word spread through the hospital that Marines were visiting Harold, other staff members and patients began gathering in the hallway outside his room. Doctors, nurses, and visitors alike were moved by the sight of young Marines honoring an elderly veteran. Many people were crying openly at the display of respect and patriotism. The Marines spent over 2 hours with Harold, sharing stories, laughing, and creating memories that would last for the rest of the old veteran's life. They promised to stay in touch with him and to check on his recovery progress. More importantly, they helped restore Harold's faith in his country and his pride in his own service. When it was time for the Marines to leave, they formed an honor guard in the hospital hallway as Harold was wheeled out to see them off. Patients, visitors, and staff lined the corridor, applauding and many crying as the Marines rendered final honors to Harold. It was a moment that transformed the entire hospital and created an unforgettable scene of American values at their finest. The visit from the Marines transformed Harold's recovery in ways that surprised even his doctors. The elderly veteran who had been depressed and questioning his worth suddenly had a renewed sense of purpose and pride. He began participating more actively in his physical therapy and spoke optimistically about returning to his daily walks around the neighborhood. Within 48 hours of the Marines' visit, the police had identified and arrested all 5 teenagers involved in Harold's attack. The video evidence from the girl's phone, which she had foolishly posted on social media before deleting it, provided prosecutors with clear proof of the assault. Witness statements from multiple community members created an overwhelming case against the perpetrators. The teenagers were charged with assault on an elderly person, a felony that carried serious penalties due to Harold's age and the deliberate nature of their attack. Their parents were shocked and horrified when they learned what their children had done. Several of the parents came to the hospital to personally apologize to Harold and his niece Rebecca. Judge Patricia Hoffman, who had been presiding over juvenile cases for 15 years, was particularly disturbed by the details of Harold's attack. She had seen many cases of teenage misbehavior, but the deliberate targeting of an elderly veteran crossed a line that demanded serious consequences. Judge Hoffman decided that these teenagers needed to understand the gravity of their actions. Instead of simply sentencing the teenagers to community service or probation, Judge Hoffman created a unique punishment that would force them to confront the reality of what they had done. She ordered each teenager to spend 100 hours working at the local Veterans Administration hospital, where they would see firsthand the sacrifices that veterans like Harold had made for their country. Additionally, the teenagers were required to write detailed letters of apology to Harold and to research and present reports about the Korean War and Harold's specific unit service record. They had to learn about the battles Harold had fought, the friends he had lost, and the hardships he had endured to protect American freedoms, including their freedom to act like disrespectful bullies. The tall boy with spiky black hair, whose name was Tyler Morrison, was particularly affected by his punishment. Working at the VA hospital brought him face to face with veterans who had lost limbs, suffered from PTSD, and dealt with lifelong health problems related to their military service. Tyler began to understand that his attack on Harold was not just bullying an old man, but disrespecting someone who had sacrificed for his freedom. The girl who had recorded the incident, Ashley Patterson, was required to spend extra hours working with elderly veterans who suffered from loneliness and depression. She learned about the challenges that older people face and how cruel treatment from young people can devastate someone who is already vulnerable. Ashley's perspective on elderly people changed completely during her court-ordered service. Meanwhile, Harold's story continued to spread across social media and news networks. The images of the Marines visiting him in the hospital touched hearts across the country. Veterans organizations began using Harold's story as an example of why communities needed to do more to protect and honor their elderly veterans. Donations began pouring in to help with Harold's medical expenses and recovery costs. A GoFundMe page set up by his niece Rebecca raised over $50,000 from people who had been moved by Harold's story and wanted to help. Local businesses offered free services, from grocery delivery to lawn care, to make Harold's daily life easier during his recovery. The Marines who had visited Harold maintained their promise to stay in touch. Staff Sergeant Washington called Harold every week to check on his progress and share stories from the base. The connection between Harold and the Marines created a bridge between generations of military service that enriched both the old veteran and the young active duty personnel. Harold's neighborhood underwent a transformation as well. Residents who had previously ignored problems with local teenagers began taking more responsibility for community safety. Neighborhood watch groups were formed, and adults became more willing to intervene when they saw young people acting inappropriately toward elderly residents. The corner store where Harold had been trying to walk when he was attacked became a gathering place for community support. The owner, Mr. Kim, created a special tribute wall featuring photos of local veterans, including a prominent picture of Harold in his Korean War uniform. The wall served as a daily reminder to everyone who entered the store about the sacrifices veterans had made. 3 months after the attack, Harold was fully recovered and ready to resume his daily walks. But this time, he wasn't walking alone. Several neighbors had organized an informal escort system, ensuring that Harold always had company during his morning trips to the store. The walks became social events that strengthened community bonds and created new friendships. The teenagers who had attacked Harold completed their court-ordered service at the VA hospital with dramatically changed attitudes. Tyler Morrison became so involved with veteran support that he decided to enlist in the Army after finishing high school. Ashley Patterson started a social media campaign to promote respect for elderly people and became an advocate against bullying. Harold received a special honor from the city when the mayor declared a Harold Jenkins Day to celebrate his service and resilience. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of community members, including the Marines who had visited him in the hospital. Harold spoke briefly about forgiveness, community responsibility, and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. The incident that had started as Harold's worst nightmare became a catalyst for positive change throughout the community. Young people learned about respect for their elders. Neighbors became more involved in protecting vulnerable residents, and the connection between veterans and active duty military personnel grew stronger. Harold often reflected on how the attack had led to so many positive outcomes. He missed Martha every day, but he no longer felt alone during his morning walks. The community had rallied around him. The Marines had restored his pride in his service, and even the teenagers who had hurt him had learned important lessons about respect and responsibility. On quiet mornings when Harold walked to the corner store, he sometimes imagined Martha walking beside him again, proud of how their neighborhood had come together and how his story had inspired others to treat veterans with the honor they deserved. The old veteran had found peace, purpose, and community support that made his remaining years richer than he had ever expected possible.